So we've been exploring this question, what limits, if any, should be placed on what a democratically elected government can do. And very closely related to that question is a kind of next question on, so how should any limits, if we do think there should be limits on governments, how should they be enforced? So we thought it would be helpful just to pull together some of the ways in which any limits on government might be enforced at this stage in the discussion. So one obvious limit that you might have in mind is, well, voters at election time can very clearly limit government in that they can decide to get rid of one government and elect a different government instead. So that's in a sense a very strong limit. On the other hand, it's a limit that only comes up every few years. So it's a pretty kind of blunt instrument for most of the time. Kind of similar in a way is voting in referendums. So that's a way in which voters can impose a particular decision on a specific question. But again, we don't have referendums very often in the UK. You might think we should have more referendums, but a lot of people are worried about referendums and whether they're really a good way of making decisions. So if we want to think about ways in which we can have kind of day-to-day limits on what governments do, then perhaps we should be thinking more about limits that are introduced through public discussion and media discussion, like a day-to-day talk about politics. So politicians are very concerned about the opinion polls, about whether what they're doing is popular or not. They don't like to have negative media headlines. So, what gets discussed in the public through the media and just how we're talking about policy decisions actually does feed through quite a lot into what governments do. And I mean, I've said discussion there, but obviously there are also mechanisms for trying to put pressure on government through signing petitions, writing to your MP, taking part in demonstrations, all the kinds of things that Anand was talking about in his presentation yesterday. On the other hand, we might be worried that who has the loudest voice in the media isn't necessarily representative of wider public opinion. So if we want to have a more sort of representative process of discussion about what government should be doing, then maybe we need to turn to our representatives. And there we have Parliament. So Parliament is, at least in a sense, representative of the wider public. And also Parliament actually has veto power on what the government does. So Parliament is able to say no to the government, that you're not able to do a particular thing. So those are all sorts of political, if you like, mechanisms of putting limits on the government. They all involve us and elections and our elected representatives and all of that kind of political process. We also talked about limits that are outside that political process. So the role of the courts might be important in enforcing legal rules and making sure that those in power are not overstepping the boundaries. But equally, we might be concerned that the courts can be a bit of a kind of sledgehammer to crack a nut sometimes. So Michael, in his presentation yesterday, talked also about the role of officials and so-called watchdogs and ombudspeople. So organizations that are charged with looking into what politicians and others in power are doing and offering advice as to whether they might be overstepping the boundaries, and sometimes having powers to enforce kind of codes of practice and that kind of thing as well. So those are a few ideas, and you might have some other ideas about the sorts of mechanisms through which limits could be enforced. So it was interesting, for example, yesterday that some of the questions that you were asking were about whether it should be possible for people to force the government to hold a public inquiry, for example, or force the government's hand in various other ways. So you might think there are other mechanisms that are important here, but of course it's always the case that there are also arguments against having these kinds of mechanisms too, that it's important for us to consider. So those are a few possible limits, and I just wanted also just to give some examples. So the difficult bit is thinking about, okay, so we've got these ways in which we could enforce limits. And then we had, as you've been discussing this morning, all of those kinds of limits that we might want. So what's the relationship between these two different sets of things? How can we relate these two things to each other? So some of these ways of enforcing limits are kind of naturally come out of the nature of the limit itself. So one of the limits was H. Some basic questions should be decided directly by the people rather than by government and parliament. So that's quite closely related, obviously, to the idea of having referendums. There are, of course, other ways in which people could be involved, but referendums are at least one obvious way. Other limits, by contrast, are perhaps associated with several different mechanisms. So we have talked about certain basic rights should be protected. And many people would say it's absolutely fundamental, if we want to have rights protection, that that is a role for the courts, that we want to take that out of the political process, out of the process where majorities can often impose their will and perhaps go against the rights of minorities. But on the other hand, many people would say, well, that's taking really important decisions, policy decisions, out of the political process, the process that we as voters are ultimately in charge of. So perhaps instead there should be a fundamental role for Parliament in protecting rights. And indeed, many MPs would see themselves as having a very important role in protecting rights and liberties. And Parliament has a committee that looks specifically into human rights issues. But people might also say that, well, unless you have a kind of culture that supports people's rights, then ultimately it's going to be difficult to ensure that those rights really are well protected. So maybe we need rights protection to come through how we discuss politics and talk about policy issues more broadly. So you can start to see there that actually sometimes some of these limits might best be enforced by various different bits of the democratic system kind of working together rather than just having one bit of the system doing all the hard work. I'll just give you a couple more examples to chew over. So one of the limits was there should be space for public comment and criticism of changes before they happen. So an obvious place for public discussion and criticism is public and media discussion. And that can be very, very important. On the other hand, as I said, sometimes there are powerful voices in the media that aren't necessarily representative of the wider public. So that idea of having a representative body able to have that the public comment and criticism may be important. So that gives a role for Parliament. Of course, there are other kinds of representative body potentially, such as citizens' assemblies, and you might think that they are important as well. And then just finally, policymakers should have to operate within agreed standards of good behavior. So here again, the courts might have an important role. If we want to have standards of not having, not giving contracts, government contracts in a corrupt way, then that's kind of something that you might obviously want the courts to be doing. On the other hand, if we want standards of honesty, Kayla talked about how important that was in your discussions last weekend, that politicians are honest. Do we really want the courts deciding whether a politician is speaking the truth or not? That could get very contentious and difficult. So maybe there's more of a role for independent watchdogs that can advise on these issues, or maybe there's more of a role simply for the public in making judgments and holding politicians to account at elections. But again, of course, that is something that happens only every few years. So again, Parliament might have an important role in having that kind of open, ongoing discussion. So those are just some thoughts from me, and I will finish there and hand back to Kayla.